On the night of the 24th of June 1948, Soviet authorities in Berlin shut off the electricity, blocked the railroads, sealed the canals, and closed the roads connecting the western sectors of the city to the rest of Western Germany. Approximately 2.5 million civilians in West Berlin had food for 36 days and coal for 45. The Soviet calculation was simple. The Western powers had only two choices: either accept that they would have to abandon West Berlin to Soviet control, or use military force to break the blockade, which would almost certainly mean a war with the Soviet Union 3 years after the end of the Second World War. The Western powers chose a third option that no one in Moscow had seriously considered possible. They decided to feed and fuel an entire city of 2.5 million people by air. For 11 months, through the German winter. The Berlin Airlift is one of those events that gets summarized in history textbooks as a feel-good Cold War moment, a triumph of Western logistics and resolve over Soviet pressure. All of that is true, but the more important story is hidden underneath. What the airlift actually was, in strategic terms, was the first major confrontation of the Cold War, and the moment when both sides discovered the rules of engagement that would govern the next 45 years. It was where deterrence was tested without combat. It was where nuclear weapons first cast their shadow over conventional crises. It was where the post-war division of Germany hardened into stone. It was the moment when NATO became inevitable. Let's walk through how the Cold War almost started and was postponed by cargo planes. First, the level set to understand the airlift. You have to understand why Berlin was where it was. At the Yalta Conference in February of 1945 and the Potsdam Conference in July and August of 1945, the three major Allied powers had agreed on the post-war arrangements for Germany. Germany would be divided into 4 zones of occupation: American, British, French, and Soviet. Berlin, the German capital, would also be divided into 4 sectors, even though the city itself sat 160 kilometers inside what would become the Soviet zone. The arrangement was designed to give all 4 allies a presence in the symbolic center of Germany, but it created an unusual geographic anomaly. The western sectors of Berlin would be an island of Western occupation deep inside Soviet-controlled territory. Access to West Berlin from the western zones would require crossing Soviet territory by road, rail, or canal. The Allies had agreed at Potsdam to maintain freedom of access through 3 highways, 3 railway lines, and several canals, but the details of how this access would be guaranteed were ambiguous. Why had the Western Allies accepted this geographically awkward arrangement? The answer comes from the diplomatic context of early 1945. Roosevelt and his advisors believed that the post-war Soviet Union could be brought into a cooperative framework with the United Nations, the World Bank, and a continuing Soviet-American alliance against future German revival. The arrangement on Berlin was seen in 1945, not as a strategic vulnerability, but as a confidence-building measure that committed all 4 occupying powers to ongoing cooperation. By 1948, 3 years later, the politics had changed completely. Several events had eroded the wartime cooperation. Winston Churchill's Iron Curtain speech in March of 1946 named publicly what many Western diplomats had been arguing privately. The Soviet Union was establishing client states across Eastern Europe and would not voluntarily relinquish control. The Truman Doctrine in March of 1947 committed the United States to support Greece and Turkey against communist insurgency and pressure, formalizing the strategic shift toward containment of Soviet expansion. The Marshall Plan, announced in June of 1947, offered economic aid to all European countries, including those under Soviet influence. But the Soviet Union rejected the plan and forbade its client states from accepting it, deepening the economic and political division of Europe. In February of 1948, a communist coup in Prague, supported by Soviet political pressure, eliminated the last non-communist government in Eastern Europe. By March of 1948, the Western Allies had begun coordinating policy on Germany in a way that excluded the Soviet Union from key decisions. The trigger for the blockade came from currency policy. On the 18th of June 1948, the Western Allies announced a new German currency, the Deutsche Mark, which would replace the old Reichsmark in their 3 zones. On the 23rd of June, they extended the new currency to the western sectors of Berlin. The Soviet response was immediate. On the 24th of June, the Soviet military government announced that the new currency violated the agreements on shared occupation of Berlin. They closed all road, rail, and canal connections between the western zones and West Berlin. They cut the electric power supply that flowed from the Soviet zone into the western sectors. The blockade had begun. The Western response was not coordinated, not prepared, and not initially optimistic. General Lucius Clay, the American military governor of Germany, was the operational center of the Western response. He had been arguing for months that the Western allies needed to take a tougher line against Soviet pressure, and he had developed contingency plans for various scenarios. When the blockade began, his initial recommendation was to send an armed military convoy along the Autobahn from the British zone to West Berlin. If Soviet forces tried to block the convoy, the United States would push through. If Soviet forces opened fire, the United States would respond. The risk, of course, was that a single firefight on a German Autobahn could escalate into a general war between the United States and the Soviet Union only 3 years after the end of the previous World War. President Truman in Washington declined the armed convoy option. He wanted a response that would maintain the Western position in Berlin without forcing an immediate military confrontation. The alternative that emerged was the airlift. Under the Potsdam agreements, the Western allies had retained guaranteed access to 3 air corridors connecting West Berlin to the Western zones: a northern corridor from Hamburg, a central corridor from Bückeburg, and a southern corridor from Frankfurt. These corridors were each 20 miles wide and ran into 2 airports in West Berlin, Tempelhof in the American sector, and Gatow in the British sector. The Soviets had blockaded the surface routes, but had not closed the air corridors, partly because closing them would have required either shooting down Allied aircraft or sending Soviet aircraft to intercept them, either of which would have been a major escalation. So in late June of 1948, General Clay made a decision. The Western allies would supply West Berlin entirely by air. The military logistics of the proposal seemed, on first inspection, impossible. West Berlin's 2.5 million civilians needed approximately 4,500 tons of food, coal, and other essential supplies per Dalton Y to survive. Coal alone for cooking, heating, and the city's electric power plants was the largest single component, accounting for roughly 70% of the total tonnage by weight. In late June of 1948, the entire American Air Force in Europe had access to roughly 110 transport aircraft, mostly C-47 Skytrains with a cargo capacity of about 3 tons each. Doing the math at that capacity, the existing American force could deliver perhaps 350 tons per Dalton Y with maximum efforts. To meet the city's needs, the airlift would need to deliver more than 10 times that volume. The American Air Force commander in Europe, General Curtis LeMay, had to find another order of magnitude of capacity, and he had to find it in a matter of weeks. The solution had 3 components. First, the Americans rapidly transferred their newer and larger C-54 Skymaster transports from bases worldwide. The C-54 could carry roughly 10 tons per degree Fahrenheit light, more than 3 times the C-47 capacity. By the autumn of 1948, more than 200 C. 54 seconds were operating on the airlift. Second, the British contributed approximately 150 transport aircraft of various types, including the larger Avro Yorks and Handley Page Hastings. Third, and most importantly, the airlift was organized using assembly line logistics with continuous flow operations rather than discrete missions. Aircraft were scheduled to arrive at Tempelhof or Gatow every 3 minutes around the clock, 24 hours a day, in all weather conditions. Ground crews unloaded each aircraft in less than 30 minutes. Tower controllers ran a continuous stack of inbound and outbound traffic with no pauses. By the peak of operations in the spring of 1949, the airlift was delivering more than 8,000 tons per Dalton Y, exceeding the original requirement. The airlift ran continuously from the 26th of June 1948, when the first American C-47 seconds arrived at Tempelhof, through the 12th of May 1949, when the Soviet Union finally lifted the surface blockade. 321 days. The operation was given the cover name Operation Vitals by the Americans and Operation Plainfair by the British. By the end of the airlift, Allied aircraft had flown approximately 278,000 flights into West Berlin. They had delivered approximately 2.3 million tons of supplies. They had flown over 124 million miles. More than 70 aviators died during the airlift, mostly in accidents during bad weather landings or in mechanical failures of overworked aircraft. No Allied aircraft was shot down by Soviet forces, although Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft guns occasionally harassed Allied flights within the corridors. The Soviets understood, as the Allies did, that any incident that produced Allied casualties would risk military escalation that neither side wanted. The American officer who organized the assembly line logistics was named William Tanner. He had run the wartime airlift over the Himalayas, supplying Allied forces in China from bases in India during the Second World War, the Hump Operation. Tanner arrived in Germany in late July of 1948 and immediately restructured the airlift's operations. He standardized aircraft loading procedures, simplified the air traffic control patterns, eliminated non-essential cargo handling, and established the continuous flow model that became the airlift's signature characteristic. His instruction to his pilots was simple. Each aircraft would fly its assigned slot, land at the assigned mini-taxi to the assigned spot, unload in the assigned time window, and depart on the assigned return slot. Any deviation from the schedule would be analyzed and corrected. He banned pilots from going into Berlin during their off time at the city itself. Their job was to fly the corridor and return, not to socialize. Under Tanner's command, the operation's efficiency improved by orders of magnitude. Inside West Berlin, the population endured a brutal winter on ration food and inadequate heat. Electricity was supplied only a few hours per Dalton Y, scheduled to allow factories to operate during industrial shifts and residential households to cook meals during mealtimes. Coal deliveries were rationed by family size. Bread was the staple. The Allies had delivered enough wheat that bread rations remained adequate, but most other foods were severely limited. Vegetables disappeared. Fresh fruit became a curiosity. Meat was reserved for the elderly, the sick, and children. The city government, under the leadership of Mayor Ernst Reuter, organized public solidarity campaigns, kept the schools open, maintained law and order, and distributed supplies efficiently. Reuter's speeches during the airlift, particularly his September 1948 speech to a crowd of 300,000 at the Reichstag ruin, became iconic moments of post-war German civic identity. He told the listening world that the people of Berlin would not abandon their city, and the people of Berlin remained. The American pilot who became the human face of the airlift was a young lieutenant named Gail Halvorsen. On a layover in Berlin in July of 1948, Halvorsen met a group of German children at the perimeter fence of Tempelhof and shared a few pieces of chewing gum with them. He noticed that, unlike American children in the same situation, the German children did not push or grab. They divided the small ration politely. On a subsequent flight, Halvorsen wagged the wings of his aircraft as a signal to those same children. And on the approach, dropped small packets of chocolate, gum, and raisins attached to miniature parachutes made from his unit, his handkerchiefs. When word spread, dozens of other pilots began doing the same. By the end of the airlift, the operation, unofficially called Operation Little Victuals, had dropped approximately 23 tons of candy on Berlin children. The pilots had no military reason to do this. They did it because the children of Berlin reminded them, on some basic level, that the airlift's purpose was to keep a population alive. Halvorsen's story would become one of the durable symbols of the airlift. He would be the man known to German children as the Candy Bomber until his death in 2022. As the airlift continued through the autumn and winter of 1948, the Soviet leadership had to confront a strategic problem that they had not anticipated when they imposed the blockade. Stalin's calculation in June of 1948 had been straightforward. The Western Allies could not, in his judgment, supply West Berlin entirely by air. The logistics would be impossible. Within a few weeks or months, the Western military commanders would have to acknowledge the failure. The Western political leaders would have to either accept the loss of Berlin or escalate to armed action. Acceptance would mean a major political defeat for the Western position in Germany and could be exploited to undermine the planned creation of a separate West German state. Armed escalation would force the Western allies to look like aggressors before world opinion. Either outcome served Soviet interests. What Stalin had not anticipated was that the airlift would actually work. By the late autumn of 1948, the Soviet leadership faced a difficult dilemma. The blockade was visibly failing. The Western allies were supplying West Berlin, the city was holding, and world opinion was crystallizing in favor of the Western position. But the Soviet Union could not simply lift the blockade without a face-saving justification, because lifting it would constitute a public acknowledgement that the Western allies had successfully resisted Soviet pressure. At the same time, the Soviet Union could not escalate, because escalation against the airlift would mean either intercepting Allied aircraft, which risked war, or imposing additional measures against West Berlin, which would harden Western resolve. So through the winter of 1948 and into the spring of 1949, the Soviet position simply stagnated. The blockade continued. The airlift continued, neither side moved. What broke the stalemate was a combination of factors. First, the airlift was working better than anyone had expected. By April of 1949, on what was called Easter Parade Day, the Allies delivered nearly 13,000 tons of supplies in a single 24-hour period, more than 3 times the requirement. The operation had institutionalized, it could continue indefinitely. Second, the political effects within Germany were turning against the Soviet position. The blockade had united West German political opinion behind the new West German state that the Western allies were creating, and it had alienated the West Berlin population almost completely from Soviet political appeals. Third, NATO was being created. On the 4th of April 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was formally established. The treaty committed 12 countries to mutual defense and gave the Western allies a formal military structure that the airlift had effectively demonstrated they were prepared to use. The Soviet blockade had in effect accelerated the formation of the Western alliance that the blockade had been intended to disrupt. In May of 1949, the Soviet Union signaled its readiness to lift the blockade. The Western allies agreed to participate in foreign ministers' talks in Paris to discuss the broader future of Germany. On the 12th of May 1949, at 1 minute after midnight, the Soviet checkpoints on the Autobahn opened. The first Western trucks rolled through escorted by American military police, while crowds of Berliners and journalists watched. The airlift continued for another 5 months, building up stockpiles in West Berlin as insurance against any renewed Soviet pressure. The final flight took place on the 30th of September 1949. The downstream consequences of the airlift shaped the structure of the Cold War. Consequence 1: the formal partition of Germany. On the 23rd of May 1949, 11 days after the blockade was lifted, the Federal Republic of Germany was formally proclaimed, joining the 3 Western occupation zones into a single democratic state. On the 7th of October 1949, the German Democratic Republic was proclaimed in the Soviet zone. The 2 German states would coexist, separated by a fortified border and a divided Berlin, until reunification in October of 1990. The blockade had been intended to prevent the creation of a separate West German state. It had accelerated that creation. The 2 Germanys that emerged from the autumn of 1949 would remain the central front of the Cold War for the next 41 years. Consequence 2: NATO became a real military alliance. The treaty signed in April of 1949 had created a legal framework, but the actual military command structure of NATO, including the integrated military headquarters known as SHAPE, was created in the years that followed. American troops, which President Truman had been gradually withdrawing from Europe before the airlift, were now stationed permanently in Germany as a tripwire force. The American nuclear umbrella was extended over Western Europe through nuclear strategic doctrine. including the eventual deployment of tactical nuclear weapons in Germany. The pattern was set. Western Europe would be defended by the threat of American nuclear retaliation against any Soviet conventional attack. This arrangement, which would later be called extended deterrence, was the central guarantee that kept Western Europe within the American alliance system for 40 years. Consequence 3. The Cold War acquired its essential pattern. The Berlin blockade demonstrated the rules of engagement that would govern Soviet-American confrontation for the rest of the Cold War. Both sides would test each other through proxies, blockades, propaganda support for client states, but neither side would directly attack the other's military forces. When direct confrontations occurred, as they would over Hungary in 1956, over Cuba in 1962, over Berlin again in 1958 and 1961, both sides would negotiate solutions that allowed each to claim partial victory while avoiding general war. This pattern, the long stable confrontation without direct combat, was the central architecture of the Cold War, and it was first tested and validated in Berlin during the Airlift. Consequence 4. Soviet political prestige in Western Europe was damaged. Before the Airlift, communist parties in France and Italy had substantial popular support, polling at over 20% in national elections. The blockade had been interpreted by many European voters as evidence that Soviet policy was willing to threaten the lives of 2.5 million civilians for political gain. Italian Communist Party support declined in the 1948 and 1953 elections, although the French Communist Party retained substantial strength. More broadly, the Western European public consolidated around a center-left and center-right consensus in favor of NATO membership, American military presence, and Marshall Plan-funded economic recovery. The political space for sympathy with the Soviet Union contracted significantly in Western Europe after 1949. Consequence 5. The Airlift created the institutional template for the modern American military airlift capability. The aircraft procedures, doctrines, and personnel systems that emerged from the Berlin operation became the foundation of the American strategic airlift capability that would later support the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the various Cold War deployments, and modern operations from Desert Storm to Afghanistan to Ukraine. The C-141 Starlifter, the C-5 Galaxy, and the C-17 Globemaster all trace their institutional ancestry to the Berlin Airlift. The Military Airlift Command, later renamed the Air Mobility Command, was a direct descendant of the operations established in Berlin under William Tanner. The capability to project and supply forces globally by air on short notice with continuous flow logistics is a permanent feature of American military power, and it was first demonstrated and proven in the operation to feed a single city through a German winter. What does this episode of history teach? First, the greatest victories are sometimes the conflicts that did not become wars. If the Soviet Union and the United States had gone to war over Berlin in 1948, with both sides still mobilized and the Soviets a few years away from their first atomic bomb, the consequences could have been catastrophic. The airlift was not a war. It was a sustained logistical operation that demonstrated resolve without combat. It de-escalated the crisis while maintaining the Western position. In every era, the most consequential historical moments are sometimes the ones in which leaders found creative third options instead of accepting the binary choice between capitulation and combat. Second, logistics is strategy. The Berlin Airlift succeeded because the United States and Britain were able to mobilize, organize, and sustain a continuous high-volume air operation across a hostile geography. Every great power confrontation since 1948 has been shaped, in part, by which side had the better logistics. The fall of the Soviet Union itself can be traced in part to the inability of the Soviet logistics system to sustain a high-technology economy under American competitive pressure. The current security architectures of the Pacific, of Eastern Europe, and of the Persian Gulf are all logistic problems as much as they are political problems. Third, the structure of the post-war order was built in real time during specific crises, not designed in advance. The architects of the Western post-war system, the diplomats of 1945, had not planned for an airlift, a blockade, a NATO, or a 40-year Cold War. They had imagined a continued Allied cooperation that did not materialize. The actual structure of the Cold War, the alliance system, the doctrine of containment, the patterns of confrontation emerged from the practical responses to each crisis as it arose. In every era, the institutions and habits that will define the next generation of international order are being built, often invisibly, in the response to the current crisis. The architects working today are also improvising, just as Lucius Clay and William Turner improvised in Berlin in 1948. On the 24th of June 1948, the Soviet Union closed every surface route into West Berlin. 2 days later, a single C-47 Skytrain, loaded with food and medical supplies, landed at Tempelhof. 321 days later, the blockade was lifted. The airlift had succeeded, the Federal Republic of Germany had been founded, NATO had been established, and the pattern of the Cold War had been set for a generation. The airlift was not the war that some had feared. It was the alternative to the war. It was a demonstration that determination, organization, and sustained logistics could prevail without combat. It was the moment when the two superpowers learned how to confront each other without killing each other. That habit, learned in Berlin in 1948 and 1949, kept Europe at peace for the rest of the 20th century. And it shapes the way nuclear powers still confront each other today. When you hear about deterrence, about restraint, about red lines, about extended commitments, you are hearing echoes of the institutional learning that happened during 11 months of cargo planes flying into a divided city. The Cold War was a long, dangerous, sometimes cruel period of human history. It was also, in retrospect, less catastrophic than it could have been. The reason it was less catastrophic, in significant part, is that the leaders of both sides learned in Berlin how to confront without combating. They learned that lesson at the cost of 70 aviators' lives and 11 months of relentless flying, and the lesson stuck. If you want more episodes that trace the long causal arcs from a single crisis to the architecture of the modern world, subscribe! There is a lot of history to explain